Today in my talk, I will be exploring the role of art journalism in the art world, thinking about why the Art Newspaper was founded 30 years ago, how we work, and what our current priorities are in 2020, a year that has profoundly disrupted the art world like so many other industries due to the enormous effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Then I will turn to the subject which is my specialism at the Art Newspaper, which is museums. I want to give a brief introduction to the key differences between European museums and American museums. I should offer a disclaimer that this will be a very brief discussion and in no way comprehensive, but I hope it will provide a flavour before we move on to the third part of the talk, thinking about the enormous impacts that COVID-19 is having for the world of museums. And that impact is not equal. It depends on where the museum is situated in the world. We're going to be thinking about how museums are adapting to the many challenges posed by the pandemic and what longer-term changes in museums we can expect in the years to come. So I would like to start off by showing you what the Art Newspaper print edition looks like. On the left of your screen, you can see the front page of issue number 1, which was published in October 1990. And on the right, you have issue number 327, published in September 2020. Now, a lot has changed in the 30 years between these two front pages, but I think the comparison also reveals the continuity of the Art Newspaper. The newspaper was founded in 1990 in one room on Fleet Street in London, the traditional home of British newspaper publishing. The name is also our identity. We are a monthly publication, but we are not a magazine. Rather than publishing academic essays about art history or art criticism or exhibition reviews, we aim to provide an essential news service for the art world. Anna Summers-Cox, the founding editor, has described the first front page in 1990 as an example of the intention to show how the art world is closely woven into and affected by the world outside. The lead story of that month was the reunification of Berlin's museums after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The editorial celebrated the good news that the cultural treasures of the remote Eastern Bloc were finally re-emerging from behind the Iron Curtain. The front page also documents the trial of an American museum director for obscenity over an exhibition of the photographer Robert Mapplethorpe. And inside the newspaper was the first interview with the director of the Museum of Modern Art in Moscow. So the Art Newspaper has always tried to be international in scope. We also aim to bring together the different corners of the art world, the museums and the academics, the books and the exhibitions, but also the art market players, the commercial galleries and auction houses. We care about art and culture, but our job is always to put it in context. Where is the money coming from? Who has the power? What are the trends and the issues that matter? So 2020 happens to be the Art Newspaper's 30th birthday. And to celebrate 30 years of art journalism, we are republishing collections of articles from our archives every month, highlighting some of the biggest stories and recurring themes in our reporting. Original investigations and research remain an integral part of the Art Newspaper's work. In May, we published an exclusive survey of commercial galleries in collaboration with Rachel Pownall, a professor of finance at the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands, and previously the author of the TEFAF Art Market Report. The survey was conducted when most of the world was under strict lockdown, and we received 236 responses from international art and antiques dealers and galleries about their outlook in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. We discovered that galleries expected to lose more than 70% of their annual revenue on average as a result of the pandemic, with the highest drop expected in the UK. 34% of galleries said they did not think they would survive the crisis, with the risk very high for small businesses with 9 or fewer employees. The majority of these galleries said their financial reserves would last just 6 months or less. In contrast, 75% of larger galleries, with more than 10 employees, were optimistic. 1/3 said their financial buffer would last over 1 year. It was clear from the survey that cash flow was a huge immediate problem. Rachel Pownall concluded that it was imperative for art businesses to have extra financial support from governments and financial markets. We asked galleries what kinds of support they needed. They told us tax relief, rent relief, and assistance with paying salaries, as well as a spirit of collaboration across the art market, such as art fairs reimbursing fees for cancelled events. The Art Newspaper has for many years conducted its own research project into the number of visitors at museums worldwide. The annual survey, published in April and called Art's Most Popular, has become an important independent data resource tracking the world's most popular museums and the most popular exhibitions every year. Our researchers spend months contacting museums and requesting their numbers for the previous calendar year, so that we can publish a full ranking and our analysis of the top trends. So here you can see the top 10 most visited museums in 2019. We know from our data that the Louvre in Paris has been the #1 most visited museum in the world since 2007, when we first began collecting this data. It held the position even when foreign tourists declined after the terrorist attacks in Paris in 2015 and 2016. Our 2020 report predates the enormous effects of the coronavirus pandemic. Next year, we expect the survey will look very different, since most museums have remained closed for months at a time, and international tourism has collapsed. Here you can see a new ranking that we introduced in 2020, looking at museums' popularity on social media, through the combined number of followers they had on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. This ranking bumps the Louvre down to 4th place after the Museum of Modern Art and Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and the Tate Museums in London. It seems likely that digital engagement will become a more important metric of popularity for museums in the post-pandemic future. But the Art Newspaper is not all about data projects and research. It's also important to us to provide a platform for influential figures in the art world to air their opinions. In our July-August summer issue, we took the unusual decision of publishing an opinion piece on our front page. This was written by Gus Casely-Hayford, the new director of V&A East, a part of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London that will open in 2023 in the former Olympic Park. He is also the only person of colour leading a national museum in the UK. His words set the agenda for an issue that reflected on the Black Lives Matter protests in the United States following the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. The article connected Britain's lack of meaningful reconciliation with its history of colonialism with the perpetuation of racism in the present. Casely-Hayford commented that the lack of arts leaders of African descent was reinforcing racial inequality in the sector. I quote, "We superserve tiny groups, audiences who just happen to resemble our staff. We know it and still do not stop it." His text called on museums to be brave so that they can build a sector that embraces and benefits from the glorious diversity of our nation. But we don't only want to hear from people at the top of the art world. In September, we published an opinion piece by Dana Kopel, a former editor and publications coordinator at the New Museum in New York, who lost her job in June. She had helped to form the museum's staff union in 2019, negotiating with management for bargaining recognition and advocating for salary increases for the lowest paid workers. Her article argues that the current crisis has only intensified the existing inequality between underpaid museum workers and highly compensated executives and wealthy trustees. She points to the contradiction between museums that align themselves with artists' progressive politics and their less than progressive treatment of their own staff, laying off workers during a health crisis and an economic downturn. Monthly printed edition of the newspaper remains our primary editorial output, we have also had to evolve into a digital-first news organisation. We publish daily content and breaking news on our website, theartnewspaper.com, and the app for iOS. And in 2017, we launched a weekly podcast called The Week in Art, sponsored by Christie's Auction House. This dissects the week's big stories with the help of special guests, who might be artists, academics, museum curators and directors, or art market leaders, as well as our own team of journalists. But on to museums. As well as being the world's most visited museum, the Louvre in Paris is one of the oldest and biggest museums around, with an especially heavy reliance on tourism. Among more than 10 million visitors in 2018, almost 75% were from outside France. In many ways, the Louvre is not a typical European museum. It is exceptional. However, I want to highlight some aspects of its funding and management that correspond to the traditional European model of public museums. In 2018, the Louvre's budget was almost 250 million euros. As a state museum, it received 100 million euros in funding from the French government, just over 40% of the budget. The rest of the museum's income was self-generated, with 87 million euros coming from ticket sales. The full price of an adult ticket to the permanent collection and exhibitions is 15 euros. A relatively small part of the self-generated income, 13 million euros, came from corporate sponsorship and patronage. Government funding for the Louvre has fallen over the past decade, from 60% down to 40%, but the French state is still a strong supporter of culture. When we recently interviewed the museum's director, Jean-Luc Martinez, about the impact of coronavirus on the Louvre, he said that government money changes everything. All our employees continue to be paid. No one has been furloughed. It is important to note that most frontline workers at the Louvre are employed by the French Ministry of Culture. Their status is therefore protected by the state. This includes security officers who represent more than half of the museum's staff, and visitor service officers who must pass the French civil service examinations to qualify. It's a similar situation in Germany and Italy. Public museum workers are public sector employees and therefore were not at risk of losing their jobs during the long museum closures due to COVID-19. This is the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, with its collection of fine and decorative art, fashion and design, and performance. It is one of 15 English national museums sponsored by the UK Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, where it is free to visit the permanent collections, but exhibitions charge for tickets. The free admission policy began in 2001 and has led to a huge increase of visitor numbers at the national museums, which have been especially popular with tourists. The UK museum model is in some ways a halfway house between the generous state subsidies of Europe and the almost totally privatized sector in the US. As with the Louvre, the V&A's government grant has fallen over the past decade, by around 30% when you take inflation into account. In the 2018 to 19 financial year, the museum received just over £40 million from the government, representing roughly 40% of the museum's £100 million income. The decline in state support means that the museum has to do more to generate its own income through fundraising and commercial activities. In the same year, it fundraised over £22 million, including membership subscriptions, donations and grants from individuals, private companies, and charitable organisations. There is still less of a tradition of philanthropy in this country than in the US, but museums are increasingly reliant on it. The V&A made around £9.5 million from exhibitions, including selling tickets, lending objects, and touring shows in 2018 to 19. It made £8 million in trading profit through commercial activities such as book publishing, merchandise in the shops, brand and image licensing, and venue hire. Unlike the Louvre, UK national museums operate at arm's length from government. The trustees on the V&A board are chosen by the government, but museums themselves are responsible for their employees and their spending decisions. Some museums have chosen in recent years to outsource services, such as catering and retail, to private companies, which means those jobs are now more precarious and easier to terminate. Since their origins in the 19th century Gilded Age, American museums have been privately funded. While Europe's royal and aristocratic collections were nationalized, there is very little government funding available for US museums, whether at a federal or a local level. However, as non-profits, they enjoy tax exemptions. American museums rely on philanthropy, a combination of support from wealthy business people who donate and sit on the museum's board, corporate sponsors, charitable foundations, and glitzy annual galas. They also earn income through paid admission and commercial activities, and the largest American museums withdraw an annual percentage from investment funds known as endowments. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York is the biggest museum in the country, with an endowment worth a staggering $3.3 billion, even when you take into account the market turmoil caused by the pandemic. But that fund is restricted. The Met withdraws around 5% a year and has said it will not and cannot increase the draw to make up for the income shortfall of COVID-19. The Met's chief executive, Daniel Weiss, told us that the museum did not even dip into its endowment during the Great Depression. Full-price adult admission at the Met costs $25, but entrance tickets make up a relatively small part of the overall budget, raising around $55 million in the 2018-19 financial year. By comparison, in the same year, the Met celebrated a new record for fundraising, totaling $211.5 million. So as we have seen in the last part of the talk, even European museums can't survive by government funding alone. They must generate a proportion of income from ticket sales and other commercial activities, as well as fundraising from the private sector. All this money depends on their physical buildings being open to the public. So when governments around the world ordered people into lockdown, museums' income fell to zero. But they continue to pay high fixed costs. It is expensive to maintain museum buildings and collections and staff salaries. At the Louvre, for example, salaries are about 40% of annual costs. At the Metropolitan Museum, staff represented 65% of the budget before the COVID-19 layoffs. This means that museums were likely to burn through their financial reserves and run up deficits during the months without income. This is leading to immediate budget cuts, such as layoffs and cancelled exhibitions, but we can expect the knock-on impact to continue for several years into the future. For smaller museums in the US, and to a lesser extent in the UK, there is a real risk of permanent closure if museums cannot recover financially from the pandemic. Now that the lockdowns are easing, museums can reopen, but the financial pressures of the pandemic continue. It simply isn't possible to welcome the same number of visitors safely because of the need to maintain social distancing. The maximum number will depend on the size of the museum, but in general, museum directors are saying that they can only accommodate around 25% of the previous capacity. Visitor admission is controlled by making sure that people book a time slot online in advance rather than just walking in. In reality, it seems that visitor numbers after reopening are still lower than 25%. In the UK, weekly data published by the government shows that national museums are currently running at 12% of their normal summer levels. A large part of the problem is the absence of international tourism, which is hoped to recover in 2021. But for people who are healthy and willing to take the risk to return to public places, I would say that this is the best possible time to visit your local museum. Museums are operating with COVID-19 safety restrictions, such as one-way routes around the galleries and compulsory face masks for visitors and staff. But if you can cope with that, and if you can navigate the pre-booking website, You will most likely get a better view and more time with the art you want to see. There have been some imaginative attempts at creating new, socially distant experiences of art. One example was the drive-through in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. The museum Boijmans van Beuningen teamed up with the city's Ahoy Arena to allow 750 people a day to drive at 5 kilometers per hour, that's walking speed, in electric cars through what it called a corona-proof exhibition. This included more than 50 large-scale works from the museum's collection and by invited artists, including paintings, sculptures, video works and installations. The exhibition was only open for 3 weeks, and visitors had to bring or borrow their own electric car, but the tickets sold out. The museum said that 22,000 people eventually visited without damage, including disabled people using their own mobility scooters and wheelchairs. It may not be a lasting solution for every museum, but it was a creative, surprising, and successful way to bring the local public back into contact with art. A much more serious consequence of the pandemic for museums has been the loss of jobs, as directors have looked for ways to cut their costs and weather the crisis. While museum workers have been largely insulated by their public status in Europe, there have been some high-profile redundancy consultations at UK museums. Museums, like other UK employers, benefited from a government initiative to protect jobs, where salaries for furloughed workers were temporarily subsidised by the state. But that period is now coming to an end, and museums are still under pressure to save money. In the United States, some museums could apply for forgivable loans under the federal Paycheck Protection Program, but it wasn't enough to prevent widespread layoffs. The fact that top American museum directors continue to receive 6-figure salaries while letting go of some of the lowest paid workers and depriving them of health insurance during the pandemic has provoked huge criticism and controversy. This, combined with the nationwide anti-racism protests after the death of George Floyd, has deepened frustrations that museums are reinforcing internal inequality, even while they make outwardly progressive promises to improve diversity in their ranks. Now here I want to give you some examples of the numbers of layoffs that we're seeing at museums in the UK and the US. At the Tate in London, more than 300 jobs in the commercial division Tate Enterprises have been lost. Tate Enterprises runs the shops and the cafe facilities in the museums, and it is owned by the Tate. But the charity says it cannot afford to support those commercial workers in the expectation that visitor numbers and therefore the museum's revenue will remain low for the foreseeable future. At the Royal Academy of Arts in London, the situation is even more serious because it is not a national museum and so it receives no government funding. The chief executive says it needs to save around £8 million a year and has announced that the majority of that will have to come from salaries. Around 150 jobs are now at risk, equivalent to 40% of the staff. And even the mighty Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York is forecasting a budget deficit of $150 million or more because of the pandemic. It has cut around 20% of its 2,200 employees since it closed in March. That's a combination. 160 staff members have been laid off, half of those in the visitor services and retail departments, while 93 people took early retirement and over 180 were furloughed in August for up to 6 months. Now, in April, the Association of Art Museum Directors, an American professional body, relaxed its rules on deaccessioning, or selling objects from museum collections. Previously, proceeds from sales could only be spent on new acquisitions. Now, museums can use proceeds for the direct care of their permanent collections, up until April 2022. The Brooklyn Museum in New York has become the first major American museum to test this policy. They have identified 12 works that they say were rarely exhibited to be auctioned at Christie's on the 15th of October. Pictured on this slide are 3 examples and their estimated prices. By Corot on the left, Cranach in the middle, and Donato De Bardi on the right. The total fundraising target for the auction is $3.5 million. But ultimately, the museum hopes to raise a total of $40 million from further art sales. That will establish a permanent investment fund that would support the costs of storing and conserving works, as well as a percentage of the salaries of collection staff. Now, Brooklyn Museum is following the rules, but selling art remains an extremely controversial topic in the museum's world, with some critics saying that Brooklyn Museum's trustees should be donating more money to ensure the works are preserved in the collection for future generations. Whatever your opinion, it seems like Brooklyn's example will encourage other American museums to consider deaccessioning as an option to shore up their finances. As museums retrench in their physical spaces, their pursuit of digital audiences looks set to continue. One silver lining of the museum closures was to drive digital innovation, with many museums launching virtual exhibition tours and social media campaigns to keep people engaged and entertained during their isolation. The Uffizi Galleries in Florence decided to create new Facebook and TikTok accounts during the lockdown in Italy, in part to appeal to younger audiences. They now have 66,000 followers on Facebook and 55,000 followers on TikTok. The director, Eike Schmidt, says that visitors under the age of 25 have become a bigger proportion of the museum's audience since it reopened this summer, compared to summer 2019, suggesting that the social media tactics have been successful. The major challenge for museums is how to monetize digital engagement. Over in Milan, the Pinacoteca di Brera has launched an experiment to test that. From the 15th of September until the 31st of December, people can sign up to Brera Plus, a membership card to the physical and the digital museum experience, instead of a single-use ticket for physical entry to the museum. The subscribers can return as many times as they want in person, as long as they book in advance online. The director hopes this will encourage more long-term engagement with the local community in the city. Subscribers will also have access to exclusive digital content, including a virtual exhibition and live-streamed music concerts. So this has been a whistle-stop presentation, but hopefully it has given you a flavour of how the Art Newspaper works within the wider art world, what the key differences are between European, British and American museums, and how Western museums have been affected by and will continue to adapt to the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you very much for listening.